Hello and a warm welcome to another edition of The Debate, coming your way from Press TV headquarters in Tehran with me, your host, Behruz Najafi. The root cause of the entire problems and divisions in the Middle East. That's how President Hassan Rouhani has described the performance of the United States and Israel in the past 3 decades. The Iranian president says that Washington has always plundered the natural resources of regional countries. He also expressed regret about a number of Arab states for cozying up to Tel Aviv and warned that the U.S. and Israel aren't the friends of Muslims and Mideast countries. Now, in today's program, we'll review the warmongering and interventionist policies of Tel Aviv, Washington, and their allies in this part of the world. Let's start the show with a background report.
Iran's president blamed the wars in the Middle East over the past decades on the United States and Israel as he addressed the 33rd Islamic Unity Conference in Tehran. Hassan Rouhani also turned the spotlight on U.S.-Israeli plots aimed at sowing discord among Muslim nations.
The most important plot hatched by enemies in recent decades was to make Muslims forget the crimes the U.S. and Israel have committed against them. They're trying to distance the younger generation from their ideals and want to portray the friend as the enemy and the enemy as a friend. Undoubtedly, the U.S. and Israel have not been and will never be the friends of Islamic nations and the regional countries.
Also speaking at a conference, Deputy Secretary General of Lebanon's Hezbollah movement, Naim Qassem, noted that Israel is not able to weaken Muslims' will to fight for the freedom of Palestine. Bahrain's top Shia cleric, Sheikh Issa Qassem, also urged Muslim nations not to abandon the Palestinians in the face of Israel's oppression. He also condemned Washington's Middle East approach. Over the past decades, the U.S. has shown no scruples about killing civilians to expand its hegemony in the region. In 1988, the U.S. Navy shot down an Iranian passenger plane, killing 290 civilians. The United States also invaded Iraq twice, once in the early 1990s and the second time in 2003. It also invaded Afghanistan in 2001. In 2011, the U.S., along with NATO and Arab allies, launched its military intervention in Libya. It deployed forces to Syria in 2014 and expanded its military presence in Iraq under the pretext of fighting Daesh. America has played a key role in the Saudi war in Yemen by selling huge amounts of weaponry to the kingdom. The U.S. has also been the main supporter of Israel in its aggression against Lebanon and the Palestinians both in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. All these wars have led to the death of large numbers of civilians. The United States and Israel have been pursuing a divide-and-rule policy in the Middle East to advance their agendas and get some of the Persian Gulf states on board. But the resistance from other nations in the region has prevented their ambitions from seeing the light of the day.
Now let me invite our guests who will be discussing the issue with me. Tonight we'll have publisher and editor of the Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos from London, and independent national security analyst Brian Downing, joining us out of Florida. Welcome to the program, both gentlemen. Let's go to London. Marcus, since 2008, Israel waged 3 wars and several escalations and offensive against Palestinians in Gaza alone. And just recently, there's been an escalation claiming 34 Palestinian lives in just 3 days. Give us your thoughts on the reason for Israel's perpetual wars and Washington's support for Tel Aviv.
Well, it is my contention that the root cause of the volatility of the Middle East is America and Israel. And the reason why America gives each year a blank check to Israel is that Israel is America's most important friend and ally in the Middle East. Indeed, without Israeli participation, then America's hold over the Middle East would not be what it is today. But it is simply undeniable, it is simply irrefutable that Washington and Tel Aviv are at the core of the problems in the Middle East. So for America's part, the American invasion of Iraq in 1991 and 2003 created incredible instability and exacerbated so much tension in the Middle East. Then, of course, we have the American invasion of Syria. We also have America supplying vast amounts of weaponry to another one of its close allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, who, since 2015, has used American weapons to devastating effect against the civilians of Yemen. Then we have the constant American military buildup in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, on the pretext that Iran is a threat to peace and stability in the Middle East. And then if we turn to Israel, well, Israel's numerous invasions of Lebanon, and in particular the 1982 invasion, really changed dramatically the dynamics of the Middle East. And because of the Israeli aggression against Lebanon in 1982 and then in the 2000s, we see that tension has been taken to a whole new level in that part of the Middle East. And then finally, we have America and also Israel supporting Wahhabist terrorists in Syria, principally those terrorists belonging to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, all of those actions which I've just cited have resulted in the deaths of vast numbers of civilians. And I haven't even made reference to the daily killings of Palestinian civilians, men,
Marcus.
women and children in both Gaza and the West Bank by the Israelis.
Exactly.
So when you just take those few examples I have just cited to your audience, it is little wonder why America and Israel are the core problem in the Middle East.
Okay, now let's turn to Florida. To Brian, Afghanistan has been subject to the U.S.-led military intervention. More than 18 years pass. Militants are even stronger than they used to be in the past. The security situation is still dire. More poppy is being cultivated by militants and others, and people live under security threats. That's what Washington could offer to Afghanistan, isn't it?
Well, the United States went into Afghanistan, well, let's see, there was the 2001 invasion, but prior to that, of course, it was because of the Soviet invasion in late 1979. And let's bear in mind that that was a war that the United States and Iran were on the same side. Iran was supporting the Mujahideen in the north, usually the Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks. And the United States was supporting the Mujahideen mostly in the south, which, of course, were Pashtun. The one today, beginning in 2001, that was a pretty serious blunder. The idea that the United States was going to transform a traditional landlocked country into a modern democracy free of poppy production, well, that was pretty ludicrous to me back in 2001. And I think it's pretty even more ludicrous today. Now, to the general things about the instability in the region, I would add there's a huge population bulge. There's a very large male population from the Maghreb off into Central Asia. They do not, the young men do not have bright prospects. They cannot get bride price. They face very bleak futures. They cannot protest for political reforms without facing deep repression. And a small percentage of them, only a small percentage, go off into groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIL. And you don't really need a whole lot of people in groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL to cause a lot of trouble throughout the region and really throughout the world.
Right. Now, Marcus, let's turn to Iraq now. The United States invaded that country in 2003, and it was under the pretext of that the former regime of dictator Saddam Hussein was in possession of weapons of mass destruction, as you remember. No WMDs were found, though, and this is Washington's support and armed Saddam Hussein during his invasion and war against Iran in the 1980s. And U.S. forces are still in Iraq, defying Iraqi politicians' call to leave. So why did the U.S. invade Iraq, and what's it doing there now?
Well, I think it's very clear, or it was very clear at the time, and it's very clear today, that the principal reason for the American invasion of Iraq was to secure the oil fields and the oil pipelines in Iraq and stemming from Iraq But there were other reasons. Iraq is rich in numerous other resources. Iraq also has a very substantial competent labour population. Iraq remains a significant buyer of arms, of weapons, and of course Iraq is in many ways at the centre of the Middle East, and of course Iraq borders Iran, and America's #1 target in the Middle East is of course Iran, and I would argue it has been like that since the Iranian Revolution. Now, the Americans have no intention of withdrawing their soldiers, their forces, and CIA stations from Iraq. When we hear some Iraqi politicians say publicly that the Americans should withdraw their military from the country, well, yes, some of them are sincere, but others are not so sincere. They have to say publicly that they don't want a foreign presence in their country, because after all, the Iraqis are an ancient people. It's an ancient civilization. But in reality, in private, many of those Iraqi politicians are part of the American network in the Middle East. They are on the payroll, to put it very crudely. So that is why the Americans went into Iraq. Iraq today has a compliant government in the context of America, and also we are very well aware that privately Israeli officials and Iraqi officials do meet, like Israeli officials and Saudi officials do meet. So I would always be very cautious when Iraqi politicians condemn the American presence in Iraq. As I said moments ago, some will be genuine, but there are some, and I suspect quite a few, who actually are quite content to see an American military presence in Iraq because it serves their bank account interests.
Now, Brian, we also have the case of Libya, in which Washington and its NATO and Arab allies intervened militarily in 2011, conducting airstrikes against the Libyan army. So how responsible is the U.S. for the chaos and lawlessness in Libya, which is described by many as a failed state?
Well, there were a lot of people who intervened in Libya. It wasn't just the United States, it was NATO, as you noted, but it was also the Muslim Brotherhood. I'd really have to check things, but I wouldn't be surprised if Iran was supporting some of the rebel groups there. What was going on there is that you had the Libyan army that was threatening to massacre large numbers of its people, and the United States and NATO intervened, helped to defeat the Libyan army, and the result, for which the United States can only be partially blamed, is a fragmentation. Remember that Libya has never been a unified country, not under Gaddafi, not under the kings before that, not under the Italian colonial period. It was always three different countries, the Northwest, the South, and the Northeast. Well, if there's ever going to be a Libya, there's going to have to be some sort of power-sharing agreement there. And I'm not sure anybody has put that formula together yet.
Marcus, do you share Brian's idea?
Well, let's be frank. Yes, the American military did not directly participate in the war in Libya in 2011. But of course, the American military was providing logistical assistance to the British and the French, and were providing satellite information to the British and the French, and also intelligence to the British and the French. If America in 2011, Barack Obama, if the Americans did not give the go-ahead to Britain and France to directly intervene in that conflict, which actually was not part of the mandate of the United Nations, the mandate was to enforce a no-fly zone. What the British and the French air forces did was to start attacking the Libyan military and other forces loyal to Colonel Gaddafi. If the Americans did not give the go-ahead to London and Paris to undertake that operation, then the British and the French would not have done that. So ultimately it is America's fault in that Libya is today a failed state. Libya is today a hotbed for religious extremism, for religious terrorism, and also as well there are now human slave markets in Tripoli. Whatever people thought of Colonel Gaddafi, he was, number one, the legitimate leader of Libya. Secondly, he built up a very, very successful health system and education system. Thirdly, Al-Qaeda and ISIS did not have a presence in Libya under Colonel Gaddafi because he wouldn't tolerate it in the slightest manner. And also, lastly, there were no human slave markets in Tripoli or anywhere else in Libya under Colonel Gaddafi. Now, what has happened in Libya since the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi has increased tension, has increased the overall divisions in North Africa and the Middle East, and of course has enhanced the Wahhabist terrorist threat to Europe, because we know that there are Wahhabist terrorist groups now operating, training in Libya, and they are not far from Europe, principally Italy.
That's right. Now, Brian, let's turn to Syria now. Washington, along with its regional allies, has been providing all kinds of support, for militant groups in Syria who are trying to topple the Damascus government since 2011. And it's maintained an illegal presence there. And just recently, President Trump said in broad daylight that he wants Syrian oil. So how do you see the U.S. role in Syria?
Well, the United States inched its way into the Syrian conflict. I don't think it was there at the start. That was more the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris. The United States eventually felt it needed to get into the conflict. The United States feels, well, we're the world leader. We can't let a war go on. We have to do something. That's unfortunate. And the United States backed one group that fizzled as soon as it went into Syria. Another one went in but didn't do much fighting, and then eventually switched sides, and it's serving with the Turks now. Right now, the American presence there in the east, I think they're there to prevent the Syrian government from having the oil resources, which are not huge, by the way, to rebuild the country.
Their own resources, right.
But, yeah, it is theirs, and I don't really see we could say that maybe there could have been a better government in Syria, but the Damascus government has won, and I don't really see the point in keeping American troops there. As I said, they're there to deny oil resources to the Syrian government for reconstruction, but I think they're also there as a potential block between Iran in the east and Syria and Hezbollah in the west. We could interrupt, the U.S. could interrupt landlines of communication between those two countries. Where that is going, how long it could last, and how it serves American national interests, I don't know. I think it's a mistake. I've been critical of it from the start.
Now, Marcus, the Israeli Prime Minister and also the Saudi monarch, they have both publicly said that they pushed President Donald Trump to abandon the Iran nuclear deal. And following the recent tension between Tehran and Washington, some analysts argue that Tel Aviv doesn't even mind the U.S. to go to war against Iran. What's behind this unwavering U.S. support for Israel?
First of all, Donald Trump's victory in the 2016 American presidential election was in part due to the support that he received from Israel and Saudi Arabia. So therefore, Mr. Trump is in debt to both Riyadh and Tel Aviv. Now, why has America given so much support to both Israel and Saudi Arabia for decades now? Well, because without those two countries, especially Israel, it is difficult to see how America would be the outside dominant force in the Middle East, or the outside dominant force in the Middle East that it has been for so many years now. Yes, America is a superpower, but at the same time, the Middle East It's not Latin America. The Middle East is a long way away. Americans need to find trusted friends and allies in the Middle East. And who better has served Washington than the Israelis and the Saudis? So that explains why when the Americans want something from the Israelis and the Israelis and the Saudis do that. And when the Saudis and the Israelis want to pursue their own objectives, the Americans will allow them to do so, because it is a massive mutual beneficial relationship that exists between America on the one hand and Saudi Arabia and Israel on the other hand. And if I may quickly say, the argument that there could have been a better government in Syria, well, you could apply that argument to every single country in the world. There could have been a better government in power in America and in Britain in 1999, because if there had been better governments in London and Washington in 1999, then uranium would not have been poured on Serbia, resulting in the massive increase in cancer.
We're short of time, Marcus. Let me put one last question to Brian, and we have only 30 seconds. Brian, Washington's close ally, Saudi Arabia, also launched this ruinous war on Yemen. More than 4.5 years past. The result is what the UN calls the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Why shouldn't the U.S. raise the cries of human rights and all that and war crimes instead of just selling weapons to the Saudis? 30 seconds, please.
30 seconds for war. Well, the Saudis buy a huge amount of arms from the United States and Britain and other countries, and no administration, regardless of its positions on various politics, can ignore that. I would prefer to see us cut our ties with Saudi Arabia. I do not see the Middle East as in the long-term national interest of the United States. And I'm talking about 40, 50 years, and I would argue for withdrawing from the region.
Okay, on that note, we'll come to the end of this program. Let me thank our guest, publisher and editor of the Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos from London, and independent national security analyst Brian Downing, who joined us from Florida. And thank you for watching this program. We'll see you next time.